Hospital Porter's pride and dignity. Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Panmo TV. I don't know how much you can see, but that's the Dreaming Spies view there, because it's all dark. It's actually about 5:30 in the morning. I'm going to London. You know, this is going up early because I've got a lot to do this afternoon, as you'll see if you watch regularly. But this is quite a rare video. It's an off-topic video. Now, I don't do many of those. This video is actually, I say off-topic. I don't think anything I ever do in my life is completely free of Panmo-esque things. I mean, everything I do, and my whole life is on topic, isn't it? But this is about something that's not directly Panmo-esque. This is the first in a series of videos I'm making called Spies of London, which is what it says. It's about spies and the ones that operate and are based in London. And I'm going to take a visit. I'm going to be taking you to visit some of the locations where these spies actually lived, worked, and everything else. And so that's my plan for this series. Now, this first particular part is about George Blake, who's like, I'll tell you a bit more about him in a minute. But the reason I'm doing this video, and the reason I've got an interest in this subject, is because I'm writing a new novel called The Obscurati Chronicles. And in fact, I've just wandered off the path. In fact, I've uploaded the first chapter. I posted the first chapter onto Ben's Bookcase. So if you go to Ben's Bookcase, that's www.panmo-bb.blogspot.co.uk, you can actually read the first chapter of my new novel. So that should be interesting. All I've got to do now is write the rest of it. That's the easy bit, yeah. But I've said this before several times. The theme of espionage comes into this new novel quite significantly, which is why I've been researching the subject. And this is why there's certain spies in particular, I think, embody the kind of espionage that I'm interested in. And George Blake is probably the most pure example of that. So I'm going to go, and this particular video is all about the spy, sometimes called a super spy, George Blake. Now, this is the subject, the principal subject of the first part of this series of videos, and this is a man called George Blake. Now, George Blake was born in 1922, and he was originally called George Behar, and he's actually a Dutchman originally, like my mother. He comes from the Netherlands, born in Rotterdam, and he's got an interesting background because his mother was a Dutch Protestant, and indeed brought him up as a Lutheran, and they went to church, and he originally wanted to be a priest, like many Marxists. His father was a half Turkish, half Egyptian Jew, who actually became a naturalised British subject, which is how Blake got his British citizenship. I think it's very interesting, actually, that a lot of these spies have these kinds of backgrounds. They're sort of very mixed, nationally mixed. And indeed, that doesn't mean I am, even though, you know, I'm half Dutch. Doesn't mean I am. But, well, at least, if I was, I wouldn't tell you, would I? Ha ha ha. But there's actually an alt-right YouTuber called Millennial Woes, who says a lot of interesting things sometimes, although I disagree with him a lot. And one of the things he talks about, he's got a video called Third Culture Kids. And he talks about the inherent problems and psychological problems and cultural and problems with fitting in of people who simply have a very, very mixed nationality. The difficulty in fitting in with any nationality, which is how they tend to reject patriotism, and they're quite easy to be recruited by any kind of internationalist movement, including Marxism, for that particular reason. Now, yeah, so this is George Blake here, and he has an interesting background because he went to Britain. He actually went to Britain. He moved here in World War II. He actually escaped when the Germans actually invaded. As I've told you before, there's a bit of family. I've got a bit of a family story associated with that, and my grandfather. I've talked about that in previous videos. But he actually ended up in Britain, and he actually joined the Royal Navy. He actually ended up going back to the Netherlands and was actually parachuted in, James Bond style, as a as a resistance sort of spy behind enemy lines. Yeah, very much so indeed. And he ended up in Korea. And this is George Blake today. Yep, he's still alive, believe it or not. I know he's pretty old. He's 97. He turned 97 in November, and he's still going strong. In fact, he's still quite vocal. A lot of people assumed he was dead because it's so long ago, and all the other spies have died. The ones I'm going to talk about in other videos, the famous spies. But this guy's still going. Now, this photo is actually it's actually a screenshot from a documentary that came out a few years ago. So this itself is not him now. This is about 3 or 4 years ago. But yeah, he's still alive. And there's an article here from the Daily Mirror that I'll go into. Now, what's the Daily Mirror voice? Probably similar to the Sun voice. Yeah, I'm going to do the the voices in the same way, the same reason I do in my roving movie reviews, so that you know when I'm speaking and inserting my own commentary. So the Daily Mirror voice, just like the Sun voice. Okay. The infamous spy George Blake is still railing against the West at 97, as the traitor is tracked down to a remote Russian home. The dacha is an idyllic rural setting, nestling serenely amid a pine forest 60 miles east of Moscow. Right, a dacha. Yeah, a dacha is a country retreat, a country home in Russia. And the rich Russians tend to have a dacha, which is kind of like a second home in the country. It's kind of a posh place you get in country life in England. It's like all the spies who ended up in Russia. Blake has been treated as with enormous luxury. He's been given a lot of money. He's been given a very senior status in society, and he's since he arrived in Russia. I'll tell you the story of how he got to Russia later. But since he arrived in Russia, he's been living a very, very comfortable life, far better than most Russians do, actually. Anyway, I'll continue. But one thing sets an ominous tone. It's 10-foot high security fence, because inside it lives a man who knows exactly who he wants to speak to and who he don't. For this is the retreat of the traitor and Britain's most notorious double agent, George Blake. Yeah, double agent. Yeah, a double agent is someone who works for one. He's an officer and or agent for one intelligence agency. Well, they're actually secretly working for an enemy agency. Recently, he has had a lot to say about why he hates the West. However, when we tracked him down, the man we branded a traitor in our 1961 front page was less keen to speak. Yeah, there's a photograph of a modern Daily Mirror journalist standing outside the dacha gate with a printout of the 1961 front page of the Daily Mail of the Daily Mirror, reporting on his trial and imprisonment. Anyway. Now at 97, many might have assumed he died years ago, but the spy who betrayed so many is not only still alive, he's issuing a new call to arms against the West. Railing against an unnamed foe, he added that intelligence officers were battling a devious enemy, the possibility of whose final defeat gives me energy to live, he said. That's a quote from Blake. He went on, "Your mission will be a difficult one, to save the planet when its destruction in nuclear war has again become a possibility due to irresponsible politicians." Right, his words, released in a statement, show that none of his hatred has abated. Well, I think at his age, he's probably not he's probably not quite right in the head, actually, with George Blake, because, he maybe misunderstands geopolitics based on his beliefs, which I'm going to go into later, and his ideas. He's probably living in the wrong country, first of all. The only reason he's in Russia is because that's the only place he's safe, because he was granted political asylum in 1966, and since then, basically after the Soviet Union collapsed, the remaining spies, and there weren't many of those, in fact I think Blake the others I think died. I don't know when the others died. I'll check that out. We'll find out when I cover their stories in future videos. But Blake was still well alive, and he, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the new presidents of Russia, including Putin, the present one, continued, basically honoured the decision made by their Soviet predecessors as giving these people political asylum. We found Blake's retreat It's down a dirt track, an hour and a half's drive from the Russian capital. He lives with his second wife, Ida, in a fenced property surrounded by tall fir trees as a guest of the Russian authorities. It's a quiet, exclusive neighbourhood, and Blake is never disturbed. The old traitor was there for sure, but today he was answering no questions. Yeah, I've tried to find out where he lives on Google Earth, and I can't see it anywhere. It's obviously they're not going to give out his address, but I went 60 miles east of Moscow. I looked at several places, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be possible to find it because there's loads of these dacha-like structures around the place, and his is just one of them. Meanwhile, local residents had got no idea that the most famous spy in the world was living in their midst. Vitaly Natko said, "George Blake lives here? Wow, I didn't know. He's still a big name in Russia. I saw the statement he released in the media recently, but I had no idea he was a neighbour. Also, the people who live near him don't even know who he is, so he's keeping out the way of his the people around his town as well." In 1955, he joined. Sorry, Blake joined. I've already explained when he joined. I'll skip that bit because I've already explained how he joined MI6 in 1955. Okay, just right. Here we go. I'll go through that anyway. I'll skip that bit as well. Blake still works for the service. In his last interview, he said he'd acclimatised well to the country. He is still a national hero. In 2007, Vladimir Putin ordered him the Order of Friendship, and he holds the rank of a lieutenant colonel in the former KGB. So that's interesting that he's still around, Blake, and he's still on the scene. And I don't know if he's watching this, but if you are, George, get in touch because maybe you'll do an interview with me. Yes, indeed. George Blake was actually in Korea when the Korean War broke out, and he ended up as a prisoner of war. And he actually went on the famous Korean Death March, and everything that was associated with that, all the horrible things that happened in that period with people dying. And so he was trapped with a bunch of American soldiers, basically, and they were all dying all around him. And he was kept in a camp with a number of other British subjects for about a year and a half. And he actually was introduced to the concept of Marxism during this time. He ended up reading several Marxist texts, including Capital by Karl Marx, which is it's actually quite a heavy read. I wonder if that's true. And there's several different stories about how he was actually recruited to Soviet intelligence. But because he was already working in the Foreign Office and for MI6 by that time. He actually joined MI6 in 1943. Now, he talks about how he actually approached his own prison guards and he asked to speak to a KGB officer, and there's a long, complicated story which I won't go into about how he ended up becoming a spy. But become a spy he did, and by the time he actually returned, he was actually eventually in 1953. After the war, he was returned to Britain. He was returned with all the other prisoners of war. And this is him getting off the plane. There was a big media furore. There's actually some video footage online of him being interviewed for the BBC. And then he meets his mother here. All very sweet. It's all very sweet and homely. But by the time these photos were taken, he was already committed to he was already committed as a KGB asset, and he was working as a double agent already. I should add actually that those photographs and the BBC interview that accompanied them took place at RAF Abingdon, which doesn't exist anymore. It's actually now the site of Dalton Barracks, which is part of the Royal Logistics Corps of the Army. However, it's actually not far from me, just a few miles from where I live, which is interesting. Now, we're going to talk about Operation Gold, because this is a very, very interesting thing. This is very significant. It's probably the most significant thing that George Blake actually did. Because, and it didn't lead to his downfall, but there's a lot associated with it that shows how important Blake was to his handlers in the Soviet Union. This Operation Gold was a plot by the British Secret Intelligence Service and the CIA, primarily British, but the Americans took the credit, as always, to build a tunnel. And this is actually in a museum in Berlin, and it is a tunnel, which is just basically a reconstruction or segment of the tunnel, which was actually stretched all the way from inside West Berlin to East Berlin. Now, what it is, if you're familiar with the geography of the Cold War, Germany used to be divided. Until 1989, it was actually two countries. One was called the Federal Republic of Germany, which was a capitalist democratic country, and the other was called the German Democratic Republic, which was a Marxist socialist country allied to the Soviet Union. It's interesting that word democratic keeps appearing in various countries' names. Like North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I think the word democratic in the name of countries is rather like in promotional marketing ads for soft drinks, where they say cool and refreshing. It's sort of like a propaganda word, Orwellian. But anyway, this tunnel was dug from West Berlin. Now, West Berlin itself was again subdivided into two halves. The city of Berlin. The western half of Berlin was actually an enclave of the FRD, the Federal Republic of Germany. And so it's a tiny little island of the Federal Republic of Germany within the ocean of the Democratic German Republic, the East Germany. And what happened was, therefore, West Berlin was a hotbed of spies, and George Blake himself actually served there quite a long time, of course, working for one side, pretending to work for one side, but really working for the other. But he was involved in this plot to dig this tunnel because what happened was the CIA and MI6 rather, wanted to listen to what the Eastern Bloc was saying to each other, the other side was saying. So they thought, if only we could actually tap their phone lines. It's a very easy thing to do nowadays with various kind of digital interception and things like that, but in those days it was far more difficult. They had to physically dig a tunnel underneath the border between West Berlin and East Berlin, and go to basically dig themselves underneath a telephone terminal where the telephone lines run, like where they run under the ground. Dig upwards and access the lines that way. And indeed, the tunnel actually lasted for a number of years. It was actually started. They started building it in 1953, not long after Blake resumed his duties for MI6. Yet 3 years later, it was apparently discovered by the KGB, by the Soviets. They went in there because there was a lot of heavy rain, and some engineers had to go in and access the lines, and they found this tunnel. Well, the fact of the matter is, the Soviet Union, the KGB, already knew the tunnel was there. In fact, they had known about it since the first spadeful of earth before the first spadeful of earth had even been dug. The reason was George Blake had passed the information onto it because he was on the organising committee for this tunnel. Amazing, isn't it? He was working for one side. This was supposedly one of the biggest secrets that the West had in the Cold War, but the Russians knew about it immediately because of George Blake. It's incredible. Which meant, and the thing about it is, because they didn't do anything about it. They didn't do anything about it for almost 3 years. They allowed it to run, knowing full well that the CIA and MI6 were intercepting phone calls and telegram lines and things like that. And so they were reading telegrams, they were listening to phone conversations, recording them, listening them, playing them back, analysing them. It was an intelligence goldmine. Yet the KGB allowed the West, in full knowledge of what they were doing, to do it. And what's more, they didn't put any disinformation in as well, because what often happens in these kinds of circumstances is once one side knows they're being listened to by the other, very often they don't say anything about it. They just start feeding disinformation to the other side instead of genuine material. But they did neither. You know why? Because George Blake was so important to them. They knew that if they pulled any funny business, they knew very well that the MI6 would smell a rat. They'd realise, how did they find out? How did the Russians know about it? And that trail would lead them probably back to someone who was on the organising committee, and lead them possibly to George Blake. George Blake was so important to them that they allowed this major intelligence victory by the West in order to protect him. I mean, there's several other reasons. People have speculated several other reasons, but I think that is definitely the most likely reason. It just shows you, isn't it, what the status of this man within the intelligence community. But it couldn't last forever. No, trouble was coming his way in the form of an agent codenamed Sniper, or Lavinia. Now this was a guy, his real name actually was Michael Goleniewski, and you can see him here, there's a picture of him here. Now this guy was a triple agent. Unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, I told you before about double agents. George Blake was a double agent. He was working for the SIS when, in truth, he was actually in the employ of the KGB, pretending to be an SIS officer. Well, he's actually an agent for the KGB. Now, there were a few agents who were triple. In other words, they were doubles, but the people on the double side didn't know they were actually working for the people they claimed to be spying on and working for, while fooling the other people and claiming they were spying on the other. And it gets a bit confusing after that, doesn't it? Yes. I always remember, do you remember Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones? Oh, they were funny, because they had this little sketch where there's these two guys pretending to be spies, and he says, it's getting very confusing at the moment. Nathan, I want you to infiltrate these agencies, MI5, KGB, CIA, find out whose side I'm on. I can well believe it. Anyway, this is a guy who's a bit of an eccentric. He actually believed he was actually Prince Alexei. That is the heir to the throne of Russia, who was actually killed in 1918 by the Bolsheviks. But they found his body in 2007. But this guy claimed that he was this young boy, who had been this young boy. But anyway, he was a very, very interesting thing. He actually decided to defect to one of the agencies. Well, I don't know if it was the double or triple side. Like I said, it's very confusing. But in January 1961, well, he started communicating since 1959. He was communicating with one of his sides that he intended to defect. In 1961, there was actually a call in West Berlin, because he was actually working for Polish intelligence in West Berlin. He actually phoned the British embassy and said, "I'd like to come to visit you, please." So he turned up. He turned up with his wife, or his mistress, rather, and he announced who he was and says, "I want to defect." And so they did. They flew him out to America. They flew him, and he started. Basically, they spent a lot of time debriefing this guy, getting as much information as they could from him. And one of the things he revealed was that the KGB had a top-level agent working in SIS, and they gave a few details. His KGB code name was Lambda 2, after the Greek letter lambda. And it took them a long time, but eventually they worked out exactly who Lambda 2 was. And they found out that it was George Blake. And in 1961, they struck.
If you're interested in George Blake and you want to know more, I can't do better than recommend these two books. The first one is The Greatest Traitor, The Secret Lives of Agent George Blake by Roger Hermiston. And it talks about here, this has got a glowing review from John le Carre, great fictional spy author, gripping a real page-turner of the Daily Express. There's the back of it. Now, it's called Greatest Traitor, and of course it's very emotive. It has the hammer and sickle symbol of the Soviet Union there. And indeed, George Blake was a traitor. Maybe not the greatest or one of the greatest. Despite this very emotive title, and it's the kind of title you'd give like a hit piece or a very biased piece of work, this book is actually quite fair. It treats George Blake compassionately, and it doesn't condemn him at all. It doesn't condemn him open-minded, with a closed-minded way. It does. The author describes himself as a biographer of George Blake, and does the best he can to to analyse him. I think that's the thing to do. Another good book is this one here, this is called No Other Choice, and it is by George Blake himself. It was written in the late 80s, and it is his autobiography. Again, hammer and sickle there. This is an old copy of it. It's an ex-library book I managed to find online. There he is. That's another good book. You can listen to Blake talking in his own words. But as Hermiston says, he's not entirely honest about everything, I don't think, Blake, especially about his recruitment to the KGB, which there's several different stories of that, and Blake gives an account which Hermiston believes is probably false. We may never know unless Georgie himself decides to speak up. As I said, the offer's open, George. If you want to talk to me, get in touch. Yeah. Can you see that building behind me? Yeah. That building behind me is the famous 54 Broadway. Rather strange thing. Look at all the roof space it's got there. They've got those dormers. It's quite something, isn't it? It's quite an amazing piece of architecture. Anyway, this used to be the principal headquarters of the Secret Intelligence Service, aka MI6. And of course, MI6 have now moved to that big, well, I think they were in that big pyramidal thing, that Illuminati pyramid down by the river that I've showed you on previous videos. I told you this wouldn't be completely off topic, and I think they moved to a new headquarters now, actually, I remember. But anyway, that's 54 Broadway. Now, it was here, a morning not unlike this one, about 8 AM, on the, well, it was maybe been a bit lighter and warmer because this was just after the Easter week. It was the Tuesday just after the Easter weekend in 1961. That the heads of MI6 actually met to discuss the George Blake problem, and they had a long meeting. George wasn't due to arrive until 10 AM, so they had a long meeting beforehand about exactly what they were going to do about it. George actually, when George was uncovered by the various people, by the various sources that I discussed earlier, he was actually at a place called Mecca, which is a language school in Lebanon. It was a place called Shemlian in Lebanon, which is just outside Beirut, up in the hills above Beirut. Picturesque location, very luxurious, as these guys tend to do. And they didn't know exactly what to do with him because they couldn't really go out there and interrogate him. They didn't have the right equipment. They think these things through very carefully. So what they decided to do was to lure him back to London, which is always a bit of a risk because if he smelled a rat, he might decide to bolt. I mean, he had a visa for Syria. He could easily have got over the border into Syria and gone to the Soviet embassy there and defected straight away. But and in fact, Blake actually met with his handler to discuss the situation, and his handler said, "Look, don't worry about it. You're safe." They had no idea about the defector. They had no idea about the other stuff about Eitner and what he had done. They didn't know about that yet. So they just reassured Blake, "Don't worry, everything's all right." Among them was a guy called Harry Shergold. Now, he was the top SIS cracker. You know, he was, if you remember that TV series Cracker, that's what I'm referring to. He was like a top psychologist. He was like a psychologically trained counter-espionage expert. His whole purpose was to police the entire agency for moles within the ranks. And so so he was called in. Now, they considered handing the case over to MI5, which is like the specialist counter-espionage organisation. They got their own cracker called James Scarden, who was the guy who had broken Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was one of the atomic spies. These are the guys who work in a scientist working for various laboratories developing the nuclear bomb, and he'd been one of the people who'd actually assisted the Soviet Union in developing their bomb, along with several others. And do you remember my review of Red Joan? I'll probably put a link in the description box to my review of the film Red Joan, because she was another one. Melita Norwood is the real character who that fictional character is based on. She's another one. So what they did was, the SIS cracker was a guy called Harold Shergold. He had the affectionate nickname of Shergy, but he wasn't a very affectionate man. He was actually as tough as old boots. If he got blood out of a stone, he'd take that as the cover story, and then he'd start probing for the real truth. So they met in this building here all those years ago and waited for George to arrive. Now, George actually wasn't coming to this building. He was coming along here to this. Now, this here is Petit France, this street here. And I don't know what building it was because this whole area has transformed since those days. You could see here there's these big government buildings. There's the Ministry of Justice here. There's the Scots Guards headquarters. It's all transformed. This kind of architecture, this brutalism. I think this indicates it was built after 61. But the MI6 used to have their personnel offices along here. I'm not sure where it was. Like I said, it's all transformed, new architecture, stuff like that. But this is where Blake was summoned. He was summoned to the personnel office because basically Nicholas Elliott, the head of station in Beirut, I would say nothing was revealed to him. They had to lure him back to London. So Nicholas Elliott, head of station, he had like a little chance. He engineered a chance encounter with Blake and told him, "Oh, by the way, George, can you pop back to London for a couple of days? The the head shed want to talk to you about just a little bit of paperwork we've got to sort out. You know, maybe they're thinking of maybe giving you a new assignment. He said, okay. That was what worried Blake, but Blake did come back here. He came back here to Petite France in just after that, like I say, on a Tuesday morning. Well, he went to Radlett and he stayed with his mother at Shanley Hills in Radlett. I got a friend who lives in Radlett, actually. I wonder if she knows about this. But and after that, he came here for 10 a.m. to somewhere on this street, on a building that's probably not here anymore. This is the personnel office of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. And once he was here, he walked in, and the moment he walked in, and he was called to a meeting, and he noticed that Shergi was there, and all the people he didn't expect to be there. He knew that something was wrong. He knew that something was wrong, and they said, George, we're not going to hold the meeting here. We're going somewhere else. Please follow us. And so he did. He had no choice but to follow them. And so follow them he did. Led George along here, along Petite France, and here to Queen Anne's Gate. And there's a pub here called the Old Star, which is right next door to 54 Broadway. So I reckon this must have been like the SIS watering hole. What do you reckon? The Old Star, yeah. They probably met here after good days of intelligence gathering, a hard day's intelligence gathering, to have their vodka martini shaken, not stirred. Yeah. Quite a place, isn't it? I'm now in St James's Park, infamous for dog bites and other things. It must have been a strange feeling for George Blake, taken straight out of the MI6 personnel and walking across St James's Park. And he wouldn't have been allowed to go on his own with just a mate, you know, or someone else, or someone in his trade union, if spies have one of those things. But he would have been flanked by Shergi and a load of other people. They would have certainly crossed this bridge on the way to where they had to go. And I wonder what was going through his head at that time. It must have been quite a sight to see this prim and proper intelligence officer walking along quite swiftly, probably silently, not talking much, with probably 3 or 4 of them all around him. I mean, there's not a lot he could have done. I mean, he couldn't exactly bolt. There's not really anywhere he could go. He could have. I mean, obviously, in these situations, you could have done a Julian Assange and just gone to the Soviet embassy, which is quite a long way from here. Actually, it's actually not near Notting Hill Gate. Today, it's the Russian embassy. But really, he decided just to play it cool. I mean, it was on this walk, it was probably going through his head all the kinds of things that was going to happen to him and the kinds of things that he would say in reply, because he knew. I mean, he understood this because he was an insider. He understood how the methods worked of interrogation and what kind of information they needed from him. So that was probably going through his head during this short walk across to where the next part of this process would begin. And here we are at the Duke of York's monument. I think they're preparing for some kind of protest, probably not another Brexit one. But anyway, we are, as we retrace George Blake's footsteps on this early morning. It was just after 10 a.m. He walked purposely up these steps here, these Duke of York steps, with his SIS escort, including the counter-espionage team, led by Harold Shergold, and up here onto Carlton Gardens. And I imagine he must have realised what was happening by now and where they were taking him, and he must have realised what plans they had for him, because this was familiar territory to George Blake. He turned left here onto Carlton House Terrace and went along this road here. And they eventually arrived here at number 2 Carlton Gardens. This is a very familiar place to George Blake because this was actually the headquarters in the offices where they were based of MI6's Section Y. This was where George Blake had spent much of his early career in MI6. Blake's interrogators took him to this room here, to the upstairs committee room at number 2 Carlton House. It was actually in that room, ironically, a number of years earlier, just a few actually, that Blake has sat down and made plans for the Berlin Tunnel and subsequently passed it on to his KGB handlers. in his own memoirs, he recalls sitting in the room and admiring the view over St James's Park over there. And he also recalls this magnificent terrace here you see as well. So he sat in that room, and he realised that why they brought him there. I mean, they could easily have sorted this out at Broadway or one of the other MI6 facilities, the other MI6 facilities which specialise in this sort of thing. The reason they brought him here is because he said that it was much easier to record conversations. And of course everything would be taped. There's microphones everywhere, every word would be taped. Now today the Secret Intelligence Service deny that there's any recording of the interrogation of George Blake. However, a lot of rumour has it, including some ex-officers, that the tape exists and is used to this day in training counter-espionage experts. Shergi got to work at once, using all his skills on George Blake, presenting him with the evidence they gathered from the defector, the Polish defector, and also from Eitner, Agent Mickey, about what they realised that he'd done. They'd basically gone through a painstaking audit and cross-referenced all the documents that the Polish defector, what's his bloody name, I can't remember, something Kowalski, Lubachevsky or something, well, everything he had gathered was cross-referenced to see who's the only guy they worked out who could have known all about these. This mysterious Lambda 2, this Agent Lambda 2. Who could it be? Who knew what all these documents were and who had passed them on? In the end, they were left with a short list of just a few names, and they eventually whittled it down, thanks to Eitner. They whittled it down to just one name. Lambda 2, Agent Lambda 2 of the KGB, had to be George Blake. But they needed essentially for him to confess, and Blake must have realised this, which is very strange because of what happened later. But anyway, they broke for lunch. This is another strange thing, right? They broke for lunch at midday after like an hour and a half's interrogation, and then they said, "Oh, Blake knew something. He knew that they were very friendly and cordial." He says they were really courteous. They were even friendly to him. They treated him normally. They all knew him as a colleague. And then he said it's very strange because normally they all went for lunch at some local Italian place, or went down the pub or something, probably to the Old Star, that's a pub next to Broadway or something like that. But no, none of them joined him, so he had to go out and eat alone. And you might think this is a bit odd, that they have a suspect, an espionage suspect, who's they think, or almost certain, is a foreign intelligence asset. And they say, "Oh, go off and have lunch and come back later." Weren't they scared he would bolt? Well, Blake didn't try to bolt because he realised that he wasn't alone. They would have had people following him. If he decided to get on the tube, if he went anywhere near the bloody Central Line, they would have probably been onto him because they know he was heading for the Soviet embassy. And so he knew better, he understood the system better than to try to get away. So he had his lunch on his own and then came back here in the afternoon. By the end of the day, they just said, "Okay, George, you go on, you head off home." So he did what he always did. Whenever he was in England, he went and stayed with his mother in Radlett. So he went up to the station and got on the train and headed for Radlett in Hertfordshire, just north of London. And he stayed with his mother. Now, he was ordered not to tell anything about anything of this to his family. So he had to keep up the pretense to his mum, which can't have been easy. I mean, he must have been churning around his head all the time. Also, his wife was almost due to have their third child, I believe, back in Beirut. He'd literally just come out from having his final exam in Arabic at the Mecca's, the language, the secret intelligence language facility, and now suddenly he was like, everything was falling apart around him. He was suddenly in desperate trouble, but he had to put up a brave face and not tell his mother about it, which he didn't. He sat down and had dinner with her and everything like that. And then the following day he came back. And they went through more and more of this, and he kept denying everything. They said things like, "Well, how do you account for this?" And he says, "I really don't know. Maybe the Russians have a top intelligence asset in the Polish intelligence service. I don't know." And unfortunately, without a confession, they couldn't really pin anything on him. Now, they also said another strange thing: his flat in Berlin was not bugged by the KGB until he had moved out and someone else had moved in. And they said, "Well, how do you account for this, George?" And Blake replied, "I don't know, you'd have to ask the KGB." He played it cool. He was a cool customer with Blake. Very, very crafty, very intelligent, very wily. You have to be to survive in that kind of business, whichever side you're on. So it was actually on the third day that there was a breakthrough, and it was it's a very strange thing. It astounded even his interrogators. Shergold just was using his psychology, his psychological tactics on Blake, and he almost inadvertently hit the right note. He hit the exact right. He pressed the right button, and this is where he appealed to Blake's ideology, because Blake was an ideological person. Once they realised that was the key to unlocking the door. Shergold said, "Look, we knew what happened to you in Korea. We know you were a prisoner. We know that we know how the Korean communists were very, very brutal. We know what happened on the death march. You watched all these soldiers dying around you. We know that you were tortured and you were maybe blackmailed, forced to work for the KGB. Maybe they sort of like coerced you, and like most spies, you weren't doing it willingly. You were just either through blackmail or threats or something like that. You were forced to work for them. We understand, George. We sympathise with you. We're very sorry. Who knows, if we'd been in your situation, we may have done the same." And that was when George said he had a gut reaction. He talks about it very openly in his book. He said that in his sort of accent, he's got this sort of Dutch, posh British accent. That was when something cracked, he says. I said, "No," I says. I was not coerced, I was not tortured, I was not forced in any way. I approached the Soviet authorities on my own accord, and I offered my services to them. The moment he said this, there was a stunned silence in the room. George Blake had just confessed. Now they had him. Now, I am now in East Sheen, which, despite its name, is actually in West London. And I must say, it's a place with a very unpleasant atmosphere. It's got a really dark energy to it. I've noticed that ever since I stepped off the train. And the actual railway station for this area has a rather dark and sinister name too. It's called Mortlake. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? Anyway, this is Vicarage Road here in East Sheen. And believe it or not, in the early 60s, one of these houses was an MI6 safe house. I wonder which one it was. And in fact, I wonder if it still is. Well, yeah. Anyway, this is where George Blake ended up. Just whatever house along here is the safe house, or used to be. It's where George Blake ended up in April 1961. He'd confessed at the headquarters of Section Y, and they were wondering what to do with him. I mean, it was a bit of a dilemma actually for his interrogators, because his confession was completely out of the blue, and it was, again, Blake himself says it was against common sense. It's not something that someone with his training would normally do. But then he was a very impulsive individual, and he had made this confession. So what do you do with him? Well, the obvious thing to do is immediately call the police, get a special branch to come in, charge him, and basically cart him off to jail. But they didn't do that. Reason is, the dilemma was they had the dirt on him, they had the goods they needed, but maybe they could have got more from him, and he was in a talkative mood. So why not see if they could get any more out of him, you know? So they decided to carry on the interrogation informally. And they did something rather unusual. They actually went to Harold Shergold's house. Shergold actually invited Blake to go and stay with him and his wife in Hampshire, their little village where they lived. And it was quite surreal. I mean, Blake himself says it was rather just like a friend's weekend away. He was even allowed to go out for walks. The only thing that made it look weird was that everywhere he went, a team of special branch officers had to accompany him as security, and they surrounded the house. He was essentially under house arrest, and he recalls making pancakes for the families. But it's not exactly. Oh my God! It's not exactly Robert Heinlein, is it? And so at the end of this, after this, they then moved him to the safe house here to continue his interrogation. One of these buildings here, he was in for a few days. Eventually, Blake it became much more informal. But he wasn't allowed any time alone. Like I said, he even could not sleep alone. He shared a bedroom with another guy. They had two beds in the room. The reason was maybe they thought he might talk in his sleep and reveal something. I don't know. But after a while. They've obviously, they're in constant phone contact with head office in the government. All this time, the government were trying to work out what the hell they were going to do with him. It was being handled by the Home Secretary, who was Edward Heath, who later on went to be Prime Minister, the one that took us into the EU. And he was saying, well, look, we've got to avoid a scandal here. We've got to avoid... and he said, well, are we going to just handle this secretly? I mean, Blake was actually seriously worried they may simply bump him off. He said, well, it's not really British to do that sort of thing, but, well, you know, some of these guys are licensed to kill. It's not all fictional, and he was worried they might decide just to dispose of him. I mean, it'd be a quick and simple thing to do. But in the end, what happened was they did decide in the end that he would face formal charges. Now, what's odd here is that very often in these situations, when you get like an agent who's discovered, a foreign agent, very often, sometimes if they can get something out of it, they'll make him an offer. They'll say, look, we'll let you go, but from now on you work with us as a double agent, or in the case of George Blake, a triple agent. So he would then, what he would then be done, he would then not tell his KGB, he'd continue operating with his KGB handlers, but he'd secretly be serving SIS and the UK. Now that offer was never made to Blake, possibly because his full confession meant he was no longer of any use, possibly because they knew that he was a good soldier, so to speak, and he would refuse. And I think, to be honest, I think he would have refused. He wasn't, like I said, I'll say more about this later, but he was he was a true believer. He received no payment for this. There was no sort of like a seductive temptress who seduced him. Nothing like that. Nothing like you often see what happens. They didn't have any dirt on him. You know, they didn't have any photos of him with some bird and threatening to send it to his wife. Nothing like that. He didn't receive a penny in payment. I think he would have refused. I really do think he would, and perhaps they knew that as well. So Blake was then arrested. The head of Special Branch actually did it. They arrested him. He was up in front of the magistrates the next day, sent to Brixton Jail. Now, all that was secret. It was all done in camera. There was no public. There was no public. No one in the public gallery. The press it was put under a D notice, and the papers couldn't report on it. But then eventually, he had to go to a full criminal trial, and he was actually tried in the Old Bailey, just like Helen Duncan. He was sent to court number 1 at the Old Bailey. And Lord Sir Justice Parker was the judge. It was all top-level people. I mean, the whole the prosecuting barrister was actually a guy with an amazing name, Sir Reginald Manningham Buller, and he was actually the Attorney General. Blake's barrister was a guy he liked, quite inexperienced young man, just been called to the bar, name of Jeremy Hutchinson. And so Blake was sort of like he was nervous, obviously, because he was facing 5 counts under the Official Secrets Act, Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act. Basically, he was a spy. And he was even worried he might receive the death penalty. There may be some clause which had never been properly abrogated that meant they could hang him. I mean, even though Hutchinson reassured him that wasn't the case, he thought, well, you know, it was all a bit up in the air. I mean, I know how that feels, actually, because it happened to me in the hospital. It's that one. I reckon it's that one. See the black car in the driveway? No. I'm getting paranoid now. I bet they've got cameras on me anyway, whoever they are. Whichever one of these it is, they've probably got cameras on me. Anyway, so Blake was up in court. Now, this had been reported to the press now, but there was a very enormous number of restrictions. At no point was MI6 to be named. George Blake was never ever to be identified as an officer of MI6. He was told he worked for the government, but he was never, and not once were they to say that he was. The name MI6 or Secret Intelligence Service was never to pass the lips of anyone in the courtroom. And the thing about it is, it all went a bit wrong because the original plan. Now, Hutchinson was against the idea of a secret trial. But on the other hand, it could work to Blake's advantage, you see, because in a secret trial, evidence could be brought to bear that would not be available in a public trial. But what happened was, it was originally going to be they decided on a secret trial, and at the last minute the judge decided to make it a public trial, which meant a vast amount of Hutchinson's case could not be presented, because it involved classified material, the names of agents, all kinds of things like that. You know, Eitner's name, Eitner was still at that time, had not been unmasked. He was still undercover. So, and then after a lot of deliberation, they decided to hold part of the trial public and part of the trial in secret. By this time, it was a major news story. It knocked the civil war in the Congo off its front pages. Even the launch of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, even that was relegated to page 2 on some newspapers. This was an amazing event. Now, the difficulty was, what could you do? I mean, Blake absolutely refused any kind of contrition. He refused any offers of mitigation in exchange for an apology. He would not show any remorse for his actions, none whatsoever. He was completely unapologetic, which of course it's not good if you go in like that. If you're trying to get a light sentence, obviously he believed, whether you share his opinions or not, whether you believe what he believed, and I don't, you cannot deny that he was a true believer. He was a sincere man. So Hutchinson tried to present it as a case of, like, he obviously, Blake wouldn't say that he'd been coerced into working for the KGB, but Hutchinson went into some of his background and things that might have turned his head as a youth, and I'll talk about more of those later on because it'll come up near the end of this video. And in the end, after the end he presented his case, then Manning and Buller came out and said, yeah, he actually produced probably the knockout punch when he said, yeah, all right, we understand you're a true believer, but you should have resigned. It doesn't have any bearing on the fact you committed treason. You should have resigned. You should have resigned from the service and maybe joined the Communist Party and gone on protest, waving flags and things like that, like David Aronovich's family used to do. And that really, I think, is the key point that Hutchinson couldn't do anything about. And unfortunately, his hands were tied by Blake's obstinacy. But, you know, I mean, I've been in a similar situation, I must say, just in terms of having, you know, I think I'm the same kind of obstinate person as George Blake was. Still is, I mean, he's still alive. I mean, it was kind of a losing battle. So he was found guilty. I mean, he pleaded guilty to begin with, so there's no way he couldn't be found guilty. It was really, the trial was one of mitigation and all the details of what kind of sentence he would receive. The sentence he did receive was one of the longest in British criminal history. He was charged with 5 counts of breaching Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act. Do you think it's that one? Oh, look, it's got a gargoyle. Do you see the gargoyle there? That's it. That's MI6, all right now. Anyway, he's charged with 5 counts. Now, what normally happened is the maximum sentence was 14 years, and these would normally be like concurrent sentences. You essentially serve them all at the same time, and the number of charges, the number of convictions for each count wouldn't actually affect the length of the sentence so much as your chances of probation and things like that. But the judge ordered that 2 of the sentences would be served concurrently. The 3 of them had to be served consecutively, one after the other. This meant that George Blake was sentenced to spend 42 years in jail. 42 years. If he'd served the maximum sentence without probation, he would only be released in 2002. It was a knockout blow. It was beyond anything anyone expected. Totally beyond anyone expected. And again, many people said that this was like a political witch hunt. It was simply done for terms of politics. It was designed to make him. It was a show trial, essentially. A lot of people made that claim, and there's some validity to that as a possibility, seeing as this was the heart of the Cold War. Either way, it stunned the nation, and even the people who had been George Blake's opponents and some of his former colleagues in the service were appalled at this. But that was it. He was convicted. He was carted off to jail. So that was it. Poor old George Blake, or maybe he deserved it, depending on your opinion. But either way, George Blake was stuck in jail. He was stuck in jail for 42 years. By the time he got out in 2002, if he served his whole sentence, he would have been almost 80 years old by then. But he had no intention of just sitting around waiting. After all, what did he have to lose? George Blake was put behind the walls you see behind me, this prison you see behind me. You may recognise this actually because one of Sandra Roy's Waking in 12 Strands scenes was actually filmed here, whereabouts where I am now, or Wormwood Scrubs. Behind me is Wormwood Scrubs prison, and George Blake was put in D-Wing. Now, whatever it's like today, I'm not sure, but back in the 1960s, Wormwood Scrubs had a reputation for being quite a lax prison, quite easy. It harboured what is today called Category B prisoners. These are not the most dangerous ones of all. And George was, even though George was first considered a high risk of escape, gradually they let their guard down because George Blake became a model prisoner. He enrolled in all the classes, and he worked hard in the canteen and things like that. He was always nice to the warders and things like that. They used to joke with him, when are you getting out, George, when are you getting out? And he said, oh, sometime. And they used to have jokes about it. But all deep down inside him, George Blake was planning a way of getting out. And eventually, opportunity knocked in the form of two other prisoners who were also his fellow inmates, because he was locked up with two other men. What he's locked up with is actually 320 guys in the D-Wing. He was locked up with two guys who was particularly important. They were called Pat Pottle and Sean Burke. Now, Pat Pottle was a peace campaigner. He was part of, I think, what became CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and he was locked up for a public disorder offence while protesting against nuclear weapons on British soil from the United States. He only got 18 months inside. Sean Burke also got like a couple of years. So they were due for release soon. In fact, Sean Burke was like on day release. He was like he had his cell in D-Wing, but he was basically in the open prison in terms of his regime. He could go out. So they came up with a plan, and what follows is probably the most famous and most daring and most incredible prison escape story in history. These two men said that they would bust George Blake out of jail. Now it all began when Bork has been described as an irrational Irishman, and he was. I mean, he wrote his own book actually about this whole escapade, along with I think the Pat Pottle wrote one as well, and his wife. But Bork was described as, or Burke was described as an irrational Irishman, and he was. I mean, getting a handle on his character from reading about him, I sort of see him as kind of Miles Johnston on Xanax. That's Sean Burke, I think. Anyway, he managed to smuggle, when he was on day release, he managed to smuggle in a walkie-talkie. Right, this meant that George Blake could communicate illicitly with people outside the jail. In other words, Pottle and Burke. Now, something that's it was a lot easier to do in those days than it is now with digital communications and things like that. But so he had this walkie-talkie, and together they hatched a plan. And the plan was enacted on the 22nd October 1966. That's D-Wing over there, you can see it. And those guard towers there, they have guys watching. Pottle and Burke managed to create a ladder. They made it out of knitting needles and twine. Most incredibly simple thing, you know what I mean? And of course everyone knew about it. All the other inmates knew what was happening, and they didn't say a word. I mean, the thing about being in a place like that is the inmates have kind of solidarity. They don't grass on each other, and of course, I mean, it's just a code. You know what I mean? It's just like a code, and of course, an escape. It's got to be the best entertainment imaginable, and when you're stuck in there, I imagine entertainment is in short supply. So at 6:15 in the evening, on the 22nd of October 1966, Sean Burke drove his car. He got a special car, especially for this mission, and he came up here and he parked it. He parked it here on Artillery Road beside this wall. I'm not sure exactly where. It was probably somewhere in this area because there's a D-Wing behind me here. So somewhere around where I am now. and he waited for the appointed time. In the meantime, George Blake had been fiddling around with the windows at the end of D block. He'd managed to loosen one of the bars on the window. He taped it up again afterwards so no one would see, and managed to remove a pane of glass. And at the exact right moment, he removed the bar, took out the pane of glass permanently, and squeezed his way through between the window frame. He then jumped down onto the ground and hid in a corner, waiting on with his walkie-talkie for Burke, however you pronounce it, to give him the word that he was ready. He had to wait a long time because unfortunately Burke had a few problems. He came down Artillery Road here, and there was a guy there used to be a gate here across the park I've just been in, and the guy came to lock it up for the night. He had to wait till that guy went. In the end, this man started hanging around and he started looking suspicious, even though he had like a bunch of flowers with him. He had this bunch of flowers with him, which was intended to make him look innocent, like he's a visitor at this hospital next door, which used to be called the Hammersmith Hospital. It's now called this guy called the Queen Charlotte and Chelsea Hospital. It's been rebuilt there, he's been Carillianised. But at the correct moment, eventually, he had to drive around and come back again. So it took about 20 minutes while Blake was like hiding behind one of the little alcoves by the wall, inside the jail here, beside the building. And he kept saying, Sean Mariah on the walkie-talkie. Where are you, mate? Where are you? And eventually, Burke said, I'm here, I'm sorry, I was delayed. Right, throw the bloody ladder over now. And so Burke, he's still on the roof of the car, and he threw a ladder over this wall here, which it didn't have this big thing on the top then in those days. It was 20 feet, so it was a high wall. He threw the ladder over, made of knitting needles and twine. It's like string wrapped up. And Blake ran over to it, and he climbed up this makeshift ladder. Now, when he reached the top, he had to drop down. And so you can see, it was quite full. And indeed, he broke his wrist in the fall and gashed his head. And Burke basically had to pick him up and carry him to the car. And Burke was actually panicking, because there were people, any minute now, visitors, and there was a change of shift in the hospital, visitors would be coming out. It was essential that no one saw him. It was all dark along here. There was none of these street lights in those days. But he managed to get him into the car and he drove off. And that was it. So George Blake was out of jail. Yeah, that was... what follows next is actually really quite incredible. So where was he going to go? Well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, the government were pretty sure about where we would go. I mean, they were anticipating something like this might happen, that the Eastern Bloc countries might, carry out an intelligence operation to break George Blake out of jail. However, if they'd done that, I mean, so when the news of this got out, the government held emergency meetings. Oh my God, the spies escaped from jail, and they thought, he's probably out of the country already. I'm sure that they've probably had a submarine waiting off the coast or something, or some ship disguised as a fishing trawler, and they probably paddled out there with rubber dinghies and stuff like that. But the truth, actually, was very different. This is Duquesne Road now. I've turned left and I'm heading east, away from Wormwood Scrubs Prison. This is the direction that Sean Burke drove in his getaway car, as trying to stay as calm as possible, with George Blake lying on the back seat, keeping his head down out of sight, away from Wormwood Scrubs jail. I'll show you where they're going to go next, because they actually had a rather unusual escape plan. I mean, the thing about it is, I think the government were hampered by their belief that only a highly organised Eastern Bloc intelligence operation had got George Blake out of jail. They hadn't counted on this being basically a much more normal type of prison escape carried out by a bunch of amateurs. And if they realised that, they may have caught him, because they were sort of watching the ports and they were watching the embassies and stuff like that. When the truth of what actually happened to George Blake was very different. I'll show you. Okay, we come to the end of Duquesne Road now, and next thing, Burke, with George Blake on the back seat, turned left here into Wood Lane. So this is the main road, Wood Lane, leading north-south through this area. He then turned right past this pub here, which is called the Pavilion, which would have been there at the time, and along this road, which is called North Pole. Remember, it was all dark at the time. It was completely dark. This was October. It was like almost 7 p.m. by then. It's probably it was only when he turned onto this road that anyone even noticed that his cell, number 8 in D Wing, was empty. it'd been a clean getaway. No one even, then they went outside and they found the ladder over the wall and things like that. But he went along this road. You can see here that there's a bridge, a railway bridge. Now it's noted in the book, it says it's a level crossing, but it can't be, because this is a bridge, and you can see very clearly that it dates, from its style, it dates back pre-1960s, so that must be a mistake. So he went under this bridge here all the time. Burke or Bork was trying to keep his cool. He hit the bumper of a car in front of him at one point, and Blake was sort of lying at the back nursing his bad wrist and had the gash on his head, keeping his head down. He put a Macintosh over him so that people couldn't see him. Burke was wearing a pair of glasses as a disguise. Must have been a right bundle of laughs. They were still very tense. They weren't safe. They were still on the way away from the jail. Then turned right onto St. Quinn's Gardens. This road here leading off North Pole Street, whatever it's called. And he came along here. Now, I hope you're following this on the map, because you'll see how close it is actually to the jail. It's taken me about 10 minutes to walk. It would have been much less than 5 minutes in a car, and they'd almost reached their destination. They were so close now. Finally, they turned right onto Highlever Road. This little long straight road here in West London, where Sean Burke or Bork had prepared a hideout. The hideaway was a bedsit, a small bedsit that had been rented by Sean Burke or Bork shortly beforehand. It was in one of these houses on this street. I know which one it is as well, because it says so in Hermanson's book. It gives the exact address in Hermanson's book. So basically they went in there and shut the door and they were free. And there was a lot of celebrating. You can imagine, well, Burke or Bork had to dump the car, so he left for a couple of hours, dropped the car, just left the key. He left the car in a dark alleyway in Kilburn, you know, and hopefully no one would see it. But he was a bit of a nutcase. He ended up phoning the police and telling them where it is, you know, giving them some clues. He was a bit of a, like I said, he was a irascible Irishman. And then he came back with a couple of bottles of whiskey, and basically Blake and he got drunk and celebrating. They watched the 10 o'clock news and laughed their heads off, because that it was released in the news purported that he'd escaped, and they didn't know where he was. He was a fugitive on the run, and basically special branch were looking for him, MI5 were looking for him. The joke was that the BBC News in those days was broadcast from Television Centre. It's now, as you know if you watched my BBC video, it's now broadcast from Broadcasting House in a different place, but in those days there was a television centre, and that was just a couple of miles, or about a mile and a half I think, from where these guys were sitting here on Highlever Road. They laughed their heads off. Unfortunately, George's broken wrist needed to be sorted out, so they got a doctor in. I think he was in the Communist Party or something. He was a sympathetic doctor, and they got him in, they got the thing fixed. It was all a bit dodgy though, because Pat Pottle started getting phone calls from newspaper reporters saying, you know, you knew George Blake in jail, what's he like? And he thought, oh my God, sooner or later, if the press can find me, the police will sooner or later, because the original plan was to have George sent to Pat Pottle's house, but you know, that's out of the question, because that's the first place the police are going to look. If they'll be looking for everyone who knows him. Once they realise it wasn't the KGB who got him out. So eventually they did move Blake. They did move Blake though, because they couldn't keep him in one place too long because of the risk of being discovered. So they actually hired a couple more rooms for him in various parts of London. He actually moved 3 times during the course that he was on the run. During the time he was on the run from prison, but of course they had to get him to somewhere perfect. He couldn't spend his whole life going from room to room. So in the end, they had to come up with a plan to get him out, and so Pottle and Burke or Bork enlisted the help of their friend Michael Randall. And Michael Randall and his family have a big van. They have like a dormobile, it's a comma van, they used to call them in those. A comma, you remember comma vans? Lovely make of car they were. They don't make them anymore. But these were like living accommodation in the back. It's like a little caravan, like a dormobile. And they decided what they would do is, they would, because Blake said, look, I've got to get out of here. And of course, going to the Soviet embassy was out of the question. He would never get in there because that was being watched like a hawk. So he thought, well, how am I going to get out? And what they did was they planned to, basically, Randall said, I'll take you on a little family holiday. Me, my wife, and 2 kids in the dormobile. and they modified it. They modified it by basically rebuilding it, like with carpentry and things like that, to create a hidden secret compartment in the back. And George Blake lay in that for most of the journey. He was allowed out. He'd get out some of the time. And so they drove to Dover. Little Christmas holiday, 17th of December they left. They drove to Dover and crossed over on the ferry to Ostend. Now, on the ferry boat, Randall and his family had to go up to the lounge and in the ship, and Blake was stuck in the car deck in his little compartment, and it was like I think it's a 4-hour crossing or something. But he survived it. He didn't suffocate. They had little air holes for him to breathe, and he eventually, when they got out on the other side, he had a long wee because he'd been cooped up for a long time, and then they drove through Belgium, through the Netherlands to Aachen, then across into West Germany. No one on the border of the Netherlands and West Germany and Belgium checked their passports. Even this was in the pre-EEC days in the Schengen zone. This was before then. But even still, they didn't check. I remember that when I was a kid. Actually, they weren't like bothered about checking passports. Many of the border gates were just unguarded. And then they headed for what's it called? Helmstedt, I think it's called. It's a border. It was the internal German border in the old days between the two Germanys, and they got through that. I mean, that was the only time when they actually opened up the back of the van to check these German border guards, and they never found Blake because the kids were just lying on the beds asleep on top of this secret compartment. Now, if they found him, it wouldn't be so bad for Blake because he could just say, look, I'm a fugitive, and he's already on the East German border anyway, so it wouldn't be a problem. But it would be very bad for Randall and his family because then they would be implicated. Blake was very careful to protect Randall, Pottle, Burke and the families of these people. The family eventually dropped him off just a short distance from the border with West Berlin. They basically, and Blake sort of hid in the bushes for a while, gave them 10 minutes to get free and get over the border themselves in their commer van. Then he walked up to the border guard, and he said, look, this is who I am. He didn't want to make it seem like he'd come by road. He wanted to make it seem like he just somehow got into West Berlin aboard an aircraft or something. He wanted to protect these people, and he was very, very dedicated to protecting them, very much indeed. And I mean, in fact, I'll just give you an idea. I mean, whatever you think of Blake, I think he had a sense of honour. I mean, many years later in the 90s, when it was discovered that Pottle and Randall had been involved in this, they were prosecuted for assisting in a prison escape and helping a fugitive and a traitor to go free. And Blake basically said to them, look, if you get a sentence of any kind of length, I'll trade myself in for you. The government will let you go in exchange for me. I'll come back to Britain. I'll hand myself in exchange for setting you free. That's very, very touching, I must say. That's real friendship. That is. There is an honour among thieves and traitors. So that's quite something. You know, it's quite something. So now, once Blake was over the Iron Curtain, he was safe because they immediately what the policy was. That anyone who defected was offered a political asylum. If you were like a spy for the Soviets and you had to get out, they would offer you political asylum permanently. And indeed, that goes on to this day. As I said earlier, even Putin is actually still honouring that political asylum, although I think he's getting a bit fed up with it, and Blake doesn't like to talk about Putin, apparently, because he's a bit concerned about this. But he's not been able to leave the Eastern Bloc countries, and since the end of the Cold War, he's not been able to leave Russia. But he built a life there for himself, and he's still there today, age 97. There was other people, a lot of other spies who I'll talk about in future episodes of films, had the same thing. They eventually defected, they escaped, and they lived a life of Riley. I mean, they live a lot better, like I said, than most Russians. They were given a nice healthy pension from the KGB for their services, a nice little dacha in the woods. You know, they get the chance to visit the best restaurants in Moscow. They were like the pigs in George Orwell's Animal Farm. I mean, compare that with the other way around. So it's noisy here. The Soviet counter-espionage organisation was called Spionum. It's called Smersh for short. Spionum means death to spies. And indeed, if they wouldn't even lock you in jail if you were caught spying, they'd torture you to get information out of you, then they'd shoot you, and you just disappear. And if you were say managed to escape, if you like been working for the CIA or MI6 or something, and you were Russian, and you managed to escape from Russia in an inversion of what George Blake did, then they'd hunt you down and kill you. They wouldn't. I mean, if you did that, you would never ever be able to look over your shoulder again in safety. You'd have to live in safe houses. You'd have to have an armed guard everywhere you went, because occasionally people would hunt you down and kill you wherever you were in the world. They'd get you, and they succeeded in a few cases. Most famously in 1940 with Leon Trotsky. They tracked him down to his hideout in Mexico, put an ice pick through his head. Oh yeah, it's a totally different policy. So totally different. I mean, there's been no retaliatory attacks attempted on George Blake or any Western double agents that defected to the USSR. None. Right, so that doesn't end the story of George Blake, and I might come back to this in a future video in this series, but that's basically what happened to him. Fascinating. Thrilling story, I thought. By the way, some of you may be wondering, seeing as I know where this house is, and it's in Hermiston's book, whether I'm going to go up and knock on the door and ask to film in there like I did with Helen Duncan and the Master Temple. Am I going to do that, Ben? You're going to do that, Ben? You're going to go and have a look at the room where George Blake was hiding out for a couple of weeks when he first got out of jail, just a short distance, 5 minutes drive from the prison. You're going to do that, Ben? Come on, show us, we want to see it. No, the house is a residential built property still. It's lived in. There are people there, and I'm going to leave them in peace. And so should you. This here is Lawn Road in North London, up in Hampstead, and I've just come along this little road. Looks like quite an ordinary kind of area for that location, but as I pan round, I suddenly find myself confronted with this. What is it? I'll step over the road so you can see a little bit better. This is one of the most remarkable buildings I've seen for a long time. Sort of white, strange white structure here. Well, this is actually called the Isaacon Building, or the Isaacon Flats, or the Lawn Road Flats. And it's a building designed by a guy called Wells Coates. It was built in 1929, and it was designed not only to be very strange architecturally and sort of nouveau kind of in a nouveau way architecturally, but it was also designed to be a new form of communal living. So it was a social experiment as well. Almost like a kind of kibbutz, I suppose, where there was like a single kitchen and stuff like that, and people only had little kitchens and stuff. But it's a strange looking thing, isn't it? Strange looking thing. It's a very weird place as well. Someone's written a book about this place. I tell you, it's really quite remarkable. But the reason I brought you here, the reason it fits in with this story. Oh look, I'll just show you the plaque first of all. I'll show you the plaque. Because a lot of famous people live. This is odd. This is the Isaacon Lawn Road Flats that you can see there. Right. And these are the people who lived there. Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, lots of famous people lived there. Also Agatha Christie lived there too. The famous mystery writer. Now, the reason this fits into this story is because there was a disproportionate number of people who lived there were spies. And maybe it's because they like the communal living thing, you know, it was like a part of their philosophy. The kibbutz type atmosphere this place had. There was a restaurant here as well called the Isobar Restaurant, which was ran from about 1930 onwards, and I think it's shut now. But there is actually a museum in here. I might have to come back when it's not open this time either. There's actually a museum and art gallery in here all about it. For example, awful lot of spies lived here. For example, two of them in particular are very interesting. One of them is called Edith Tudor Hart. Now, she was a famous photographer. She was also an ardent socialist, and she spied for the Soviet Union. Yeah, it's isn't that odd? You may think, well, it's just a one-off, isn't it? Just a one-off. I mean, there's different kinds of spy. I should point out. When people say spy, you know, well, what does that mean? What do you mean by spy? Because there's different sorts. Because you often say, like, people use the word secret agent. So people say, oh, James Bond is a secret agent. Well, no, he's not. The word agent does not apply to an employee, an officer of an intelligence agency. That person is called a case officer. So James Bond would be described as a case officer. An agent is someone they recruit informally who's not on the staff. Like Henri Paul, one of the men implicated in the death of Princess Diana. He was an agent. He wasn't working for the intelligence agencies, he wasn't employed by them, but they gave him money in exchange for information, that sort of thing, because he was head of security at a hotel. There's other kinds. For example, there's the officers could be legal or illegal, as could the agents. A legal officer would be someone, for example, at an embassy, like someone who's got an official role within the embassy or the foreign office. Several spies have been like that. The illegals are people who really are deep undercover, and that includes like double agents like George Blake. That's an illegal. There's also others called cutouts. Cutouts are people who are just used as couriers to transmit information and things like that. But they don't actually have any information themselves. They're just paid a certain amount of money, or they do it for some other reason, just to like send messages, carry parcels, things like that. So there's lots of different sorts. Now, the people who were in here, the people who lived here, were primarily illegals. They were illegal agents or officers. And as I mentioned, one of those is Edith Tudor Hart, who fits in with someone else called Dr. Isaac Deutsch. Now, he is, as we're coming to the end of this particular video, I want to bring him up because he's very important. Because he fits in with the next part of this video that I'm going to talk about. And he lived here, at the Isaacan Flats. Oh, it's dark. Pitch dark. Oh dear. Welcome to the 50th parallel, guys. It's not even 5 PM. Yeah, the day is ending like it started. It's been a long day. But it's dark again. The funny thing I wanted to talk about was, the funny thing is, and I wanted to talk about this and go into some more detail. George Blake never apologised for anything he did. He was not ashamed of anything he did. He was completely unrepentant even when he was in jail. And he didn't have any escape plan. He thought he was going to be in there till he was 80 years old. He never once regretted anything. He never called himself a traitor. He actually said this. He said something very interesting. He said, where is it? Sorry, I've got my notes here, but where is it? He said, to betray, you first have to belong. I never felt I belonged. That is very telling, I think. It's a very telling statement for the kind of people who become like George Blake. You see, I can kind of sympathise here, simply because I used to be very left-wing when I was a child. When I was about 18. When I started at the hospital, I became very left-wing. I was pretty much apolitical until then, although I went through a Welsh nationalist phase. I became very left-wing, but it's something I got over very quickly. I mean, the Cambridge Spies used to joke, that it's like measles. Marxism's like measles. It's something all children you'll go through it at some point and you get over it. And it was like that for me. I was only hardcore for less than a year. I saw through it very quickly, but other people embrace it, and they continue with it all their lives. And I'm curious why. I mean, this is why. The reason I'm doing this, of course, is because of my new novel, The Obscurati Chronicles. And you can actually read a sample chapter. I think I might include that in the description box as well. Of The Obscurati Chronicles, which is basically, this film is kind of research for that, and this series of films is research for that, because I have a character in my new novel who is essentially like George Blake, the Cambridge Spies, etc. He's like these people. And the thing is, he is rather like, it may have been something to do with his background. He spent some time, he was influenced, I think, and his cousin says this, he was influenced by one of his other cousins, a man called Henri, who was half Egyptian, half French, another third culture kid, and he was like a member of the Egyptian Communist Party. He ended up being very active in France and being assassinated, actually, during an uprising there. Can't remember which one. France is always having uprisings, isn't it? It's a long list of uprisings in France. He was very influential, Blake. Very influential indeed. And that's I think is another reason. But there, I think it was where he lived. He lived in this big palace with his aunt and uncle, who were kind of like lords and ladies of some kind in this poshest part of Cairo. And he'd go out and he'd see this poverty everywhere. Now, poverty all over the place. And of course he began as a... I don't think he ever lost his religion. This is very, very strange. I want to pause for a moment and do a little aside in the studio, because this idea is extraordinary, is unusual. You get religious people who become radical leftists in the Marxist sense. And so I'm going to just do a little aside now.
Now, I want to just take a moment to explore this extraordinary idea. That is the Christian theological interpretation of Marxism, which you think is almost a contradictory. It's almost like an oxymoronic phrase, where the two are like oil and water for most people. However, there are a few individuals who have embraced both and reconciled both, and even equated both in a really strange way. George Blake is one of them, and the other one is this guy. This is the Very Reverend Hewlett Johnson, who was Dean of Canterbury Cathedral from 1931 until 1963. His nickname was the Red Dean of Canterbury because he had this extraordinary support for the Soviet Union, when in fact Johnson was only one of a large number of intellectuals who had been convinced that the Soviet Union was the way forward and that it represented progress. And these are like very much a middle-class intellectual, mostly guys, few women, who were born sort of in the late Victorian period and who sort of grew up, who came of age sort of in the 1920s and 30s. Now, it's a weird thing. It really is a strange thing. But they toured the Soviet Union and things like this. I mean, Sam Aronovich was one of these people, David Aronovich's dad. And in that book, Party Animals, that I talk about in several videos actually, like The Day for Freedom and the alt-right book launch. Yes, he was just one of these individuals. I mean, the thing about the Soviet Union is they were quite happy to welcome people, Western trade union leaders and university professors, and they showed them around the country. But of course, they showed them the highlights. They put them on the showcase tour. I mean, North Korea does this today. You can visit North Korea; it's quite easy to do, but you have to go on a package tour. You can't backpack. And the Soviet Union was the same. So they show you all the nice shiny bits and all the peasants who'd been deliberately given good food for a couple of months to make them look healthy. They'd been to the dentist a few times and had a bath, and they put them in front of these Western intellectuals and trade union conveners and people like that. And so these guys will come back and it'll be like it'll be like that film I'm All Right Jack, the Ealing comedy. They'd be going, hey, that's the Soviet Union for you guys, working in the fields, enjoying yourself, lying in the buttercups, and then opera in the evening. It's that sort of thing. So Johnson was one of these people. The difference with him is he was a Christian. He was a believer in God, whereas almost all the others to a T were atheists. In fact, my own experience of trade unionism is that the left is almost exclusively atheist. It's these weird exceptions like Johnson, like George Blake, that interest me. And indeed, what Johnson said about socialism and Marxism was pretty much the same as George Blake. He believed it was an embodiment of the Christian ideal, even though it was explicitly non-Christian, explicitly materialistic. They still somehow saw that as the embodiment of God's message on earth. They took the words of Jesus and they said things like, what was it Jesus said something like, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Well, that's kind of like what Karl Marx said when he said, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, and things like that. They would come up with these strange parallels. I mean, Hewlett Johnson, he moved in these kinds of circles because he was a campaigner for the poor during the Depression. He was a young curate at when the first Depression broke out, and he was appalled by that, just like a lot of these spies ended up being. A lot of these spies were radicalized in this way, as I've explained and will explain further in this particular video. And indeed, this is directly relevant to my new novel, The Obscurati Chronicles. In fact, in 1945, just after World War II, Johnson actually went to Moscow and he had a meeting with Joseph Stalin, and he said what a wonderful man he thought he was. It was quite remarkable. I mean, he became something of a Stalin revisionist as well after the Khrushchev revelation. So I mean, he's rather like this chap. There's a chap called Grover Furr who goes around trying to rehabilitate Stalin, but Johnson was doing it like in the 50s and 60s. So he got in there first. In 1951, actually, Stalin even gave Hewlett-Johnson an award, the Stalin Prize for Peace. Did you think there? Did you not know there was one of those? Yep, there is. What next, do you ask? The King Herod guide, the King Herod Award for Childcare. The thing is, I get the idea with Hewlett-Johnson, and I get the same feeling with George Blake. In fact, I'm certain of it is George Blake. These people, within their own minds, are not malevolent. They see themselves as good. They don't consider themselves evil. They're not hateful people who want to do harm. I think they are naive. I mean, it's often said, you know, that whenever a socialist government takes power, they have massive purges. And as one commentator, Jonathan Bowden, puts it, they have to have purges to get rid of all the idiots, the people who think it's all about love and peace. I mean, it sounds a bit cruel, but you know, funny enough, Yuri Bezmenov, the dissident from the Soviet Union who fled to Canada, he said that in the 1920s the Soviet Union had a policy that if ever they conquered the Western world, the very first thing they would do is round up all the members of the Western Communist parties, every single one, without any trial, without any qualification, and shoot them. And the reason is because once these people who had always believed in communism with their whole hearts as something good and wonderful and peaceful and loving, once they saw the reality, they would become the most radical reactionaries of all because of the betrayal they felt, on top of the general hurt the philosophy was causing. Yeah, and I got a feeling that Hewlett-Johnson might well have been one of the first people up against the wall.
Now, if you read the Roswell trilogy, which I recommend you do, available at all good bookshops now, price £10, etc, etc. The second book of the trilogy, Roswell Revealed, my main character, Siobhan, meets up with Flying Buffalo, another character, and Flying Buffalo's talking about this another character called Julian, so they're discussing a third character. And this is very interesting because the character Julian, when I first started concocting, when I first started writing the novel and design and planning the story, my original idea was to have Julian become a spy in the George Blake sense, Cambridge 5, etc. But very quickly I realised that he didn't have the temperament for that. I mean, characters, when you're writing characters in fiction, they tend to take on a life of their own. I realised he did not have the temperament for it, so I abandoned that idea. But I never ever abandoned the idea of creating another character and putting them in a different story, and that's what I've done. But Flying Buffalo says this about Julian. Now, Julian is a Marxist. But he's like I say, he's not very level-headed. He's a bit of a nutcase, actually. In fact, you could call him the ultimate tanky. He tries to. I don't want to give you spoilers, but he will do anything, even destroy the world to get what he wants. And Flying Buffalo says this to Siobhan about Julian. Julian is a familiar type. You see, we live in a world where there is injustice, inequality and deprivation around every corner. Are there worse things than being born into that deprivation? Perhaps being born into a privileged position in such a world and not being the kind of person who can simply say, to hell with it, I'm all right, Jack, and enjoy the fruits of their good fortune. Julian is one of those who can't do that. His empathy will not allow him. It breeds in him toxic guilt. Marxism is an enticing lure for people like Julian, and I think that's kind of what I mean when it comes to when I'm talking about this. That's kind of what I mean. That sums it up, I think, and I've done it very well in that novel, Roswell Revealed and A World After Disclosure by Ben Emlyn-Jones. Read it now. Now, he was I mean, the word traitor, of course, but he was literally a traitor. Now, and I would call him a traitor, if for no other reason than his actions led directly to the deaths of many people, because he gave information on British agents operating behind the Iron Curtain, and CIA agents as well, and they were tortured and killed by East Germans, by the Stasi in East Germany, by the Securitate in Romania, by the KGB in Russia. And Blake denies this. He said that he only gave his information to the Russians, and he made them promise, hand on heart, Scout's honour, that no one would be harmed as a result. Well, you know, a man in his position in the intelligence services must know that that's extraordinary. He's not that naive. And a man in his position who actually is a professional intelligence officer. Absolutely not. He mustn't. That sounds to me like a cop-out on his part, I think. Interestingly, just something else I want to talk about. I won't put in a studio segment here, but there's a play called Cellmates, and it actually starred Stephen Fry, and it was doing the theatres a little while ago, and it got terrible reviews, which led to Stephen Fry getting a terrible breakdown. He had a nervous breakdown. The poor guy does suffer from these problems time and time again, and he actually disappeared, and people thought he might have committed suicide because he has attempted suicide before. But the play Cellmates was about the George Blake story in jail and him being busted out. And I don't know if Fry plays Blake or Burke or Bork, I'm not sure. But just a little aside there. Just going through my, getting through all my notes here. So he was a traitor in that sense. He really, really was. It's an interesting sort of like concept. People say treachery is. I mean, this was a line in that film, Another Country. He said treachery is relative or subjective or something like that. The character played by Rupert Everett. Who, interestingly, Marek Kaniewska, who directed that film, very good film about these boys in public school. Guy Burgess. He plays a young Guy Burgess. He goes on to direct another film about the escape of Kim Philby, and I'll say more about that actually in a future video. But I'm actually not interested in most spies. I mean, despite this film I've made, you see, because most spies are ones like John Walker, who was an American intelligence officer, a naval officer, who basically he approached the KGB like Blake, offering his services, but he wanted money. He was doing it completely and utterly for money. He was not interested in the politics of the things. He was not interested in any principle. He wanted them to pay him for information, and he made a lot of money off it until he was caught. And he managed to recruit all the members of his family. It was called the Walker Spy Ring, and involved all members of his family. This is why I'm also not interested in the Portland Spy Ring. This was a contemporary of Blake's. In fact, they were Lambda 1. The leader of that, whose name I can't remember. This was the Portland Bill Naval Base. He was another spy ring. He was codenamed Lambda 1. Blake was Lambda 2. And again, it was a financial thing. Most spies are like that. They're either trying to make money out of what they do, or they're threatened in some way through blackmail, or the Epstein thing. You know, we got a photograph of you with a young male model we put him in your bed. These photos go to your wife if you don't do A, B, and C. That sort of thing. Oh, it's the honey trap, the usual thing. I'm not really interested in those. I'm interested in the ideologues. Because my character is an ideologue. He's like Blake. He's an ideologue. And these are the spies I'm going to focus on in this series. That's why I won't really talk about any of the others, actually. They don't interest me. They really don't interest me. Now, we all hear this. I mean, Blake probably thinks this as well. The Cold War is over, and communism lost. But it didn't. And we're in a strange situation now. In a sense, the Cold War is all the more poignant today when we look back at it, because we see the results of it played out in a way that neither the victors nor the vanquished ever expected. Communism is alive and well, but it exists in a different form. A much more insidious and much more subtle form. It's called a soft-kill communism. And the heartland of this soft-kill communism is the so-called capitalist West. The victors in the Cold War who defeated vanguard communism through the 20th century. I mean, the irony is delicious beyond words and painful beyond words. And what's even more ironic is that Russia, the country which was the capital of and the nucleus of vanguard communism through the 20th century, from 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution right up to the 1980s and the rise of Gorbachev and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. It's Russia now that is, in a sense, one of the most... fireworks. Look at that. It's Russia that is one of the most... the countries, I think, is leading the fight against this. The Russia, I think, is has shown remarkable immunity to cultural Marxism, to this soft-kill communism. And they have resisted it, and it's... I mean, the leftists actually saying that Russia is a fascist country. When they mean fascist, I mean, fascist is a nonsense word. It just means, oh, we don't like you, that's what it means, basically. They're saying Russia is a fascist country, and what they mean by that is that Russia is a country that is resisting this soft-kill communism. And these are elements I'm going to put into the story of the Obscurati Chronicles as well. So the book all I've got to do now is write the book. That's the easy bit. Yeah, like hell, Ben. It's going to take a while, I'm afraid, but the book will come out. Oh yeah, so I'm just fascinated by these characters. I am. In a sense, they represent a part of me because they're me as I used to be during this very brief period of my time. But I remember distinctly being a kind of a raving lefty myself, albeit for a short time. I mean, I was 18. I mean, come on, guys, let me off. 18-year-olds are idiots, aren't they? And I saw through it very quickly, I must say. I might even write. I did write an article about that actually, but I deleted it. It's one of the few articles I actually deleted because I was so embarrassed about it. But maybe I'll come back to that at some point. Maybe I'll come back to it. So yeah, it's been quite a day. I think we've really gone into the depths of this particular case, and I look forward to taking you on other journeys to study other cases in the world of ideological spies of the left. So we find ourselves on the last part of this little journey at an underground station. This is Belsize Park underground station in Hampstead in North London. And I brought you here for the final time in this particular video because this is a very important place when it comes to the story that I'm telling you in this series of films. It's just a short walk from the Isokun Flats as well. Because it's interesting actually, because one of the people who lived in those flats, Dr. Arnold Deutsch, used to come here regularly. This was a meeting place for him, a covert meeting place. He would meet up with some people. He wouldn't say anything. They would just come and walk beside him. Not a word would be spoken. They wouldn't even make eye contact, and they would just walk side by side down this road until they turned into a little side street where it was quieter and they could talk, or one could hand over information to Dr. Deutsch. He met lots of people. There were 4 in particular he was assigned to watch over. You see, Dr. Arnold Deutsch was a handler for the KGB. He was an illegal, but he did have an official capacity in some form, but he was not like a legal at the embassy. And his job was to recruit and to manage and to run secret agents within the British establishment. 4 men in particular he was particularly close to and had a particularly prominent role in controlling and managing. These 4 men were called Anthony Blunt, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean. History will come to know these 4 men and many others, some of which were never caught, as the Cambridge Spies. And it is in a future series in this video that I will tell you the full story of the Cambridge Spies. Thank you for watching Hapanwo TV. Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order.